Have you ever wondered whether the problems in the world today would exist if we had deeper connection to ourselves, others, and the environment, and acted from that place?
Welcome to the Conscious Action Podcast with your hosts Brian Berneman and Kayla Greenville, who believe that connection is the key to taking conscious action as individuals and creating a better world.
We are here to raise awareness and inspire meaningful action by sharing stories, knowledge, and conversations with thought leaders and changemakers.
From sustainability to well-being and everything related to conscious living, our mission is to empower you to be the change that you want to see in the world.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Action Podcast. I am Brian Berneman, your host, and for this episode I have the pleasure to be joined by Laura Hartley, all the way from Sydney, Australia. And I'm sure that this is going to be such a wonderful conversation based on our previous conversations, Laura. So first of all, thank you for taking the time, for being here, and for sharing the work that you do and what you're bringing to the world. So the first thing that I would love to know is, who is Laura? What can you share about yourself so that our listeners get a sense of who you are?
Thank you, Brian, for having me on the show. So I am really excited to be having this conversation today. So as you said, my name is Laura Hartley. I am an activist, a writer, and a coach. And so I run an online school now for activists and for changemakers, which is really helping provide the regenerative foundations for change-making work and to help create the conditions in the world for social healing and collective thriving. So I'm currently based in Sydney, Australia. Most of my work takes place on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and really excited to be here having this conversation today.
Beautiful. Thank you for being here. And I would love to know a little bit, Laura, on what really led you into this work, and how has your childhood and your journey inspired you to actually do this type of work?
So I think the word childhood there is quite relevant, because that has played a huge influence in why I do what I do today. So I grew up in a household that was very much like surrounded by personal growth and personal development. My mother ran one of the first life coach training schools in Australia. Some of my earliest memories are like listening in the car to like Wayne Dyer and Deepak Chopra and these very kind of new age spiritual teachers at that time. And, at that age, I couldn't stand it. I wanted nothing more than to, turn that radio off and listen to something a little bit more fun. But it had a really deep influence on who I would become and how I would use certain tools later. So as I entered my adolescence, I really struggled with mental health issues, really severe depression, anxiety, absolutely crippling me for a number of years. And it was that time that really provoked me to think back to the spiritual teachings that I was and that we can work with. And so I became really interested in these contemplative traditions, in meditation, in how we respond to life's events. And then this kind of interest in our inner world became an intersection then, as I became even older, with the outer world. So, I started to question, well, how does this actually apply to, people who were starving in Yemen, or to women who are, or girls who are forced into marriage? How does this actually apply in the real world? And how do we start to look at the beautiful work of personal development and the beautiful work that we can, and experiences that we can have with spirituality, and actually apply them to the world today and to the changes that we need to see happening? So out of that, I really became an activist. I became very interested in well-being economics, particularly in recent years with climate activism and environmental activism. And then this kind of led me to the work that I do now, is creating this school, creating courses that help activists and changemakers really explore their inner world, really create more stronger foundations to the work that we do, and in particular to kind of explore this intersection of inner and outer change together in the same space and the same time. So it's a long and winding journey, but there's been so many different influences in my life that have led me here.
Beautiful. And I really resonate with some of the things that you were just sharing. I think that for me, one of the really interesting realizations in my own path has been this understanding of the fact that there is no separation, and no separation in the inner and the outer, the below and the above, me, you, everybody else, and how we can start to weave that into how we are showing up in the world, how I am showing up in the world, and what is the inner work that I've been doing for so long. How is that also manifesting in the world, and what can I do? Because for me, and this is one of the keys with the work that we do through conscious action, is understanding that this connection is one of the key elements that we want to tackle, and that this connection is both from ourselves as individuals, not understanding of how we are connected, how we are part of our Mother Earth, and how we treat each other, and how we show up for her as well. So I'm really interested in this type of work that you're doing as well, because this is what I'm doing. Slightly different perspectives and slightly different ways of going through it, but it is really, really aligned. And one of the first things that I would love to ask you about is, in terms of this work that you're doing, you mentioned activists. There's, I think, that a lot of misconception of activism and the people that are activists, and I would love to get your point of view on what activism is, why is it needed, and let's go from there, and then we can develop a little bit more.
You're so right. For a long time, I felt very uncomfortable calling myself an activist. I thought that an activist was somebody only that, they took to the streets and they were like super out there, and they were with politicians, and they were like front of the marches and all of these things. And certainly that is a form of activism, and that's also a form of activism, that I've been more involved with. But I really subscribe to Joanna Macy's definition of an activist, which is anybody who is active for a purpose bigger than personal gain. And so this is why, I tend to use the word changemaker as well, because sometimes we're more comfortable with that word, but I really believe in embracing the word activist. But the more of us who are working for a more beautiful world, who have a purpose to what we do that is greater than ourselves, is really a form of activism. And so we can use our business as a form of activism. It might be that our activism is, starting an urban farm. It might be community initiatives. It might be creating spaces for healing in our communities. It doesn't always look like this really traditional idea of activism that we have. Coming back to that idea, well, why am I doing this? Is it for the community? Is it for people? Is it for love? Is it for a value? Where is it for something bigger than my own gain? And when you can find where that is, whatever it is that you are doing is activism. And it's an important distinction. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and because for me, and this, I think that there's a few words that have been really overused or used in ways that it's just, yes, as you're saying, what we believe that activists are is those people that, yes, are perhaps outside and are, that for some people might look sometimes more like what Extinction Rebellion is doing, which I think that this is something that I always say to people, we need all of these different ways. And even though perhaps some way might not be my way, there's a place for all of these different ways. There's a place for the people that are doing activism just at home by leading with their actions. And there's people that are doing, as you're saying, something in the community. There are people that are starting like a regenerative farm. There's people that are doing something in the business sphere. Other people that are doing something more towards government policy. Like this whole biosphere of actions are needed. And yet I think that most people are, you were saying, like we all have, like if we hear the word activist, what we come to mind first is that type of activism. And one of the things that I'm interested in your perspective on this is I talk to lots of activists that do that type of activism, and one of the key things that I have worked with some of them and that I've been trying to get more into that space as well has been the fact that there is so much burnout of people that are doing that type of activism. And I talk to some, especially younger people, and trying to get them to get more balance and to be able to understand their well-being as part of their actions. So I'm interested in your experience with this and your point of view in terms of like burnout in this activist world and how you approach it.
Yeah, I mean, burnout is so common, like even going beyond activism and the change-making world, just the rate of burnout that exists today, whether it's in corporate spheres or whether it's in the post-COVID world or, you know, after lockdowns that so many of us are experiencing, but particularly in activism, as you said, certainly being in climate activism, amazing people who really care about the work that they're doing and who are so passionate about the work that they're doing, but who just aren't able to continue or aren't able to stay with long haul work because, you know, we go all in, we do absolutely everything, we commit, and then long after we're kind of like, oh my God, I have no energy, I've got nothing left. What is this like despair that's creeping in? And, you know, we collapse and we kind of pull back. And then a lot of the time we end up in cycles of this. Like you see that a lot, particularly with, again, with environmental activists, of going in, giving it everything. You know what, I'm just going to take 2 weeks off. I feel fine after 2 weeks. And then you do feel better because you've had a break. Yeah. And then you go back in exactly the same way. And before long, you're burnt out again. And so one of the ways that I tend to frame burnout that I think is important is that burnout is a system problem. And it's not just the fault of individuals. You know, there is so much individual work to burnout, particularly within our bodies, our working styles, making sure that we're not ending up in these cycles of like in and out. But ultimately, burnout is a result of systems that do not serve us. And those same systems exist in activism as much as we wish they didn't. You know, very often we think we're in very progressive spaces. We think we're you know, we're changing the world. We recognize all of the problems with capitalism, or we recognize the problems with society and the way that it's structured and how they're not supporting us. But then we're not actually changing these systems and how we come together. You know, so many of us have internalized them to this point that we don't even realize, and we're showing up and we're working in the exact same way. We're creating the spaces and the deadlines and everything in the same way that, you know, capitalism or the world is. And so, of course, burnout becomes inevitable. And so when we're looking at burnout, it really means that there's work to do at two levels. You know, there is this individual work of our body, our nervous systems, our heart, our values, ensuring that we meet our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. You know, this is individual work that we are responsible for. And then there is also work in how we come together. And this is the kind of community work. This is the idea of, well, what are the systems that are in place that are influencing us? How do these systems show up through us and as us? How are we supporting one another? What do we have in place to deal with conflict? What do we have in place to deal with stress levels, or with the fact that we can't output at the same level all the time? And so then there's this community and systems work. And this is very often what gets missed in burnout, in any sort of burnout work that happens. And this is why, of course, it keeps on happening and happening at the rate that it is happening.
Yes, definitely. And I'm interested in exploring a little bit more on this about system change. Like for me, this is as you're saying, this is the underlying theme on a lot of the issues that we're going through in this world today, like both on a personal level, because we have internalized, as you're saying, like a lot of these systems, and as well as societies. And I'm interested as well in this in terms of the times that we're going through with, things have changed in the last while, like since COVID came into our lives. And I don't want to get too much into COVID itself, but the fact that, things have changed. For me, this has been a really interesting time, because I, like at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is what I've been waiting for, some disruption, like in big scale, that can bring about a lot of these changes. And I see some of it, but at the same time, I see that, as you're saying, the changes are also operating within the same systems. And I wonder, like, what do you think of the possibilities of changing those systems?
Oh, it's such a good question. And, I felt really similar when COVID began, that it held so much potential for us to really radically reimagine and shift systems in a way that, we hadn't considered possible. Everyone had said for so long, oh, no, that will never happen, where it really was possible. And it's a shame that we didn't capitalize on that as well as we could have. But I think large scale system change is not only possible, but inevitable. I think, firstly, there's this idea that we tend to be very stuck in our mindsets of just, this is the way things have always been, and so it will always be that way. And actually things haven't always been this way. And, we're really approaching this within the framework of just our culture and our mind and our way of looking at things, when there's so many other potentials out there. And change is the most natural and constant thing that we have. So the question is not whether they will change, but how we want them to change, how intentionally we will change them, and how quickly we will change them. And certainly, I think with the climate crisis and everything else, we will continue to have these opportunities to step up and to make that change. But to come to the other point of what you were saying, I think, we can't or we won't change those outer systems that don't serve us until we also look at how they show up within us and what it is within us that perpetuates them, that lives them, breathes them, speaks them, that these systems are not something just outside of us. They're not just happening somewhere in politics, somewhere in the legal system, somewhere in the world. They live and exist and breathe within every single one of us. And a lot of the time, we can't even see how that happens or how that is, because we're so enmeshed in it. It's like that great story. I'm totally going to get this wrong, but around the fish is swimming by and another fish comes by and he's like, "How's the water today?" And the fish is like, "What? What's water?" We can't see what we're in. It's what is natural to us. And so for us to really create the level of system change that we want to create, we need to first examine, how are these systems existing within us? And how do they serve me? Because on some level, they often do. How are they not serving me? And how am I perpetuating them consciously and unconsciously? And so there's so much work we can do there to break it down. But I actually think that's why the COVID window wasn't what we wanted it to be, because we hadn't done a lot of that inner work to really allow a transition there to something new and something much more intentional.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's interesting because for me, I recognize a few things in my own experience. I recognize privilege, and I recognize that my privilege is a thing. And it took me actually quite a while to recognize some of my privilege, because I also come from communities and cultures that have been, not privileged. Like I come from a background that my family and my culture is Jewish, which means that in places that, like growing up, I was an outsider, and I was in a sense put down because of where I came from. In different places that I lived around the world, because of being Latin American as well. Like it's been, like I'm a minority, yet at the same time, I am a man. For the most people would say I'm still white. I'm educated, like I have all of these different aspects of myself, and I had to recognize that and to understand how am I going to use this privilege because I have it. And I think that is a really interesting aspect that I want to ask you in a moment and to explore a little bit more in depth. And the other aspect that I recognize as well, which has to do with what you were just talking about, is the inner work that we do as well, in terms of how we are healing the individual and collective traumas that we have. There's a lot to unpack there, but that as well is part of what enables these systems to keep on going, because we are not recognizing some of these deep issues that are there and how those have been handled and how we can come out of them and transform and transmute them so that we can move to a new way of doing things, that the new ways of doing things are also the old ways of doing things, just with a twist. So I want to put those two things to get a little bit of your sense of how privilege and that healing and recognizing that collective entanglement will help us to move forward.
This is a huge topic. And there's so much that I would like to share here. I think, first of all, you've touched on an interesting word here, which is healing. And one of the reasons when I talk about the school that I run, that I talk about social healing and not social change, is because actually I think the idea of social healing is something a lot deeper that we really need for transformation. That we're no longer at a stage where we can just have, incremental slow change. We really need wide-scale transformation. And the only way that that's going to happen in a positive way, or in the manner that we kind of want, is to have this level of healing that is required. Because, as you said, our systems are reflective of deeply traumatized ideas, deeply traumatic people, and they continue to traumatize us as well. It's not just one way, it's kind of feeding back in and of itself how this pain perpetuates itself and how pain manifests in how we act. So I think from a healing perspective, it comes down to a few different levels. I actually think there is a huge amount of personal and embodiment healing that we need to do. There is a brilliant book by Berneman called My Grandmother's Hands. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
No.
So it's written very much from a US perspective. It's around healing racialized trauma. And it's very much written at the level of the nervous system and at the level of the body, that particularly we as white people and what we're experiencing in relation to people of color, and how our nervous systems are primed to react. And then, of course, how that reaction within our nervous systems kind of morphs into our systems and into our ways of acting, and obviously further and further up the chain, all the way into our police and legal systems as well. So really brilliant book that I recommend. So I think that there is healing that all of us can do within our own bodies to calm our nervous systems. And it's only once we've done that, and that feeds into burnout so well, because obviously when we have burnout, our nervous systems are like fried and like so overactive, that we have the space within us to properly explore our privilege, to properly explore how systems exist within us. So we have to kind of do this body level work first. And then, the healing, once we've done that level within the body, we've done that level within the mind, healing then transforms into our relationships. It's how we're being together. How are we acting with each other? How are we supporting one another? And I'm a big believer that, our movements can be spaces for healing. We actually, and this is something that I think we could do a lot better, but we should have ways of working. We should have regenerative or generative conflict resolution skills built into our communities and into our networks. And when we can do this, when we can start to look at how we're relating to one another and how I'm interacting with this person and how my interactions are feeding off my own anxiety, my own pain, my own fears, and whatever else it may be, then we can allow that healing to start to happen between us as well. So again, there's so much we can unpack, but this kind of body level out first, I think, is really important.
Yes. It's really interesting because for me, a lot of my own personal journey started with embodiment and going back into my body to understand it, to understand how it feels, to understand how it is in relationship to the outside world, in relationship to other people, in relationship to my own mind, and to be able to get more anchored in this part of my experience that I was completely removed from for the first 15 years of my life, and how through that and through a lot of the tools that I use for healing and for doing that work, how that has enabled me to actually go out and be in relationship. And a lot of times I talk with people around the space of learning in education. For me, education is one of those systems that is not working as it potentially could. And what you're saying in terms of this, developing these skills and developing these tools with frameworks that are more inclusive, more regenerative, both from like our perspective as well as natural perspective, how changing that system could create so much change. Because if we have the tools to communicate, to first understand, and then to be able to communicate in ways that enable exchange of ideas, of understandings that are open, that are, like I really like the framework of nonviolent communication, but there's so many different frameworks to be used in developing communication skills that enable us to be in that space. The listening, the being open and not close to other perspectives, especially when they are going to clash into our own perspectives. This space is so needed, and this is why, for me, having more people like what you're doing, you're developing this in your school, like you're developing ways that we can explore some of these ways. And I would love to know a little bit more, like in terms of that, how do people, like from your experience, how do people start in that journey? Because we all come from different places.
Again, exactly. And we all have different starting points. We all will have different places that started. But, I started in a very similar space to you with, in a sense, with that body work, because I didn't realize for up until I was about 27, 28, that we actually feel in our bodies. I was so disconnected from what I was experiencing in my physical body that I had no idea that, our emotions are really taking place all over our physical sensations. They're not just in our head or in our mind. And culturally, we lived so neck up. We are such a society that values mind over matter, and our thoughts above everything else. And so I think that is a place for us to start for all of us, because it's only when we start with, okay, well, what do I feel and where do I feel it, that we can start to be able to sit with what we're experiencing, to not run away from it, to not try and escape from it, to not have it lash out in conflict or in pain and to create more drama, and to be able to then explore where it sits within us. And when we can do that and we can start to create that space, we can then start to actually have a wider field of imagination. We're not driven by our pain or by our trauma as much anymore, which is a big thing, even for those of us who are in change making. It's so easy to be doing this work and still be driven by our baggage. We're not immune from it. None of us are, myself included. And so when we have this ability to be with the body, to be with what we're experiencing, then we can actually create a much more responsive, a much more generative, a much larger field for us to work from, so that it's no longer running away, it's no longer pushing against, it's no longer being dictated and reacting to somebody else's story, but we're really giving ourselves space to have something grow and emerge from within us. And we can't have that emergence until we've created that space. So if somebody really doesn't know where to start, I always recommend the body. Start there, start exploring what we feel, start exploring how we feel it, start exploring what we feel when we're with certain people. When we step out of our comfort zone, when we talk about certain issues, what is it that makes us alive, that lights us up, that gives us energy, that really opens our shoulders? What is it that really makes us feel heavy and weighed down and like nothing is possible? And when we can explore this level of physicality, that's when we actually have space to respond.
Yes, definitely. As you just said, this is my start point most times as well, because it was for me, and I acknowledge that this has been the way that most of us have been educated, using our heads and not so much in connection with the body. And I'm interested, I'm going to switch it a little bit. I'm interested in exploring a little bit more the system change and the system change as well in terms of change makers. I talked about this actually the other day. I was teaching at university a class, and it's a few younger people, and they were we were exploring values and purpose and things like that, and someone said I don't know my purpose, and they were stressing about that, and I was like, well, there's no need to know your purpose, and as people that want to do something for the world, as change makers or activists or whatever we want to call it, for people that want to do something positive because of all of the things that are happening, how do you explore that space of of values and purpose, and not having to necessarily have that clarity or having it?
I think purpose is made as much as it is found. There's often this idea that purpose is this big overarching thing that comes down from the heavens, and now you found your purpose in life and everything's going to be great. It so rarely works that way. I think actually the word I prefer to use is callings, because I think each of us we all have callings, and our callings change over time as well. What calls you in one moment won't necessarily call you a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So it's this constant listening to what is calling to me right now. Where do I want to work that lights me up, that feels like this belongs to me? Not just this is what we're supposed to do, because so many of us, there's so much work that's needed in the world, and a lot of us are doing really important, amazing work, but it doesn't actually speak to us. And if it doesn't speak to us and it doesn't nourish us in some way, then I also think it will inevitably burn us out as well. So I think coming back to this idea of what calls me, and if we have no idea, again, return to the body. When I think about different topics, what do I feel physically in my chest, in my belly, in my heart? What do I think about when I have free time and when, I'm not constrained by anything else? What is it that I really dream of? And really let yourself dream and imagine much bigger and much deeper than you ever would think is possible. Like, I'm big believer in forgetting these limitations of what we think is possible. We limit ourselves far too much. And then if we're still unclear, or regardless, maybe we are clear, using our values as verbs. Our values are not passive. They're not this nice thing that we have. There's something that we do. We live, we breathe, and we act them out through our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So, if we value justice, actually, what does a just relationship look like? What does a just relationship with myself look like? What does a just relationship in my community or with my family or friends look like? How would I embody that in my thoughts, my words, and my actions? And am I actually carrying this through on every level? Because sometimes we get caught up in conflict or in stress or anxiety about a certain situation. And, we skip away from our values so easily. Or let's say another one of value is compassion. And we can see so easily how compassion applies to the causes and the people that we care about. But what about the people who perpetuate those injustices? Where is our sense of compassion for them? And, that's not to say there's no accountability. That's not to say there's no justice there, but compassion is not reliant on anything else. So how are we exploring it in a wider framework? So I think these two things of looking at, well, what are our callings, what speaks to me? And then how am I living and breathing my values can give us a path forward when we don't know where we want to go.
Yes, beautiful. I often talk and within this framework of living our values, and I often say, how can we shift from reacting to life to responding to life? And that response to life is a more conscious, aware, purpose as in like in purpose, like something that I'm choosing to show up in that way. And as you're saying, having this understanding of how are those values being breathed into my life, it's really important to understand how am I showing up right now and embodying that and being able to put them into practice and to be able to have the openness and curiosity to explore them. And it's really interesting when you were talking about the calling. That reminded me a lot of I studied that and I put it into one of my courses. The idea from the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell and awakening to that call or receiving that call and going with that. I think that, thank you for sharing that, because that brought me back to that, which I haven't explored in a while now. So I will get back into it. And I want to get Laura a little bit into what's going on now in within our climate, and how we can, as change makers, do something about it, and what is the space really for change makers to have a place in changing what is happening when it seems that it's so daunting and so big.
Yeah, I think, there's so many different areas that we could look at here, but there is something to be said for this feeling of being overwhelmed and daunted by the world's problems. And it makes sense, the scale of things that we need to shift in the world, and the enormity of things like the climate crisis are so overwhelming to our nervous systems. And I actually really believe when we feel kind of frozen and like we don't know what we want to do next, and like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do? That is very much a freeze reaction, of our nervous systems, like the fight, flight, or freeze. It's a survival mechanism. So we need to kind of move beyond that. But the other aspect of it as well is the story that we're working within. So when we're working to change the world, very often we approach it from a narrative of saving or fixing or rescuing And especially in climate activism, you see it all the time around, we need to save the planet, we need to save the world, save the oceans, everything else. And this narrative can be really problematic. It really has embedded within it this David versus Goliath feeling, which gets overwhelming very, very quickly. It keeps us very much stuck in somebody else's narrative. We are always reacting and responding to what is happening over there. It's not a generative story. It's not something that we're creating. It's a very reactionary story. It's quite binary usually. It's very much embracing of the idea of us and them. And, good, bad, evil, win, lose, everything else. And then, of course, it's very perpetuating of burnout as well. And so, because it's kind of this, it activates this danger mode in our brain. So when we're working to save the world, we must be working to save it from or against something. And even though most of us know in this exact moment right now, there is like little to no threat to our survival, our bodies don't know that. And we are continually telling our bodies that there is a danger, there is a threat. And so, of course, they're getting overworked and overwhelmed and going into freeze mode of, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do now? And when we look at the world from that story, or that we need to save everything, how do we know what to do or where to begin? We don't. So we really need to shift that narrative. And there's a lot of other narratives that we can use that actually give us a much larger framework for our work. Stories of nourishment, stories of care, service, healing, liberation. These can all underpin the work of change making without perpetuating the danger mode in our bodies. They give us a much more imaginative sphere to work from because they're not reacting to somebody else's story. They're really quite self and community driven. So they give us this platform to kind of reimagine everything that we want to do in the world. And they're much more inclusive. They're much less, they're not as binary. They're not as us versus them. They hold space within them for possibility. So when we don't know what we want to do in the world, when we're looking at the scale of the problems, I think it's important that we also look at, well, when I see these problems, what story am I saying about them? Am I saying that the world is, screwed, for want of a better word, and do we need to do something? Or, there's no hope left? Or am I saying that we need to just overhaul and fix everything and save it? Or can I look at the world's problems and go, okay, where is there space for growth? Where is there space for nourishment? What do I want to heal? What would love do? What if love was the foundation of my work? What would my work be then? And so look at our values, look at our stories, and try to reimagine possibility if we can.
That's so beautiful. One time, my teacher of systemic and family constellations, he told me, how can we include and accept and be grateful for all of the people, businesses, organizations that are quote unquote doing the wrong thing for our earth, like as you were saying before, like having that compassion, because in that way we are including everything and we can move from this moment forward without leaving anything behind, without excluding, without pointing fingers, and being able, as you were saying before, like this is a way of reimagining things. Because if we keep on perpetuating this division of you are destroying the earth versus I am going to save it, and I'm perpetuating these archetypes as well, and being able to not include and not being able to transmute what has happened and learn from what has happened to move forward. That is a really challenging place to be, and to be able to move past it as well. And I'm interested as well in getting your thoughts in terms of being able to do this type of work. How people in their lives, when they, I'm going to bring two different groups of people, and I'm going to really generalize it, and even though I don't like to do this too much. One is the group of people that feel guilt and shame, and that a lot of times freezes them. How they can continue? And then how can a lot of people that are in survival mode also do the work? Because this is two different types of group of people that I'm going to, as I said, generalize. This is mostly the two biggest groups of people, the ones that in a sense we can do things, but as well we can get paralyzed and we can feel that guilt and shame. And these people that are, surviving, and how can they do anything other than, I need to find food to eat today or I'm dying.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the guilt and shame, it's helpful to know that, and something we need to actually understand is that guilt and shame are almost never drivers of positive change. In our own lives, in the world, in children, you would never think, if there's a child, and you're trying to teach them something, that the best way to teach them is to shame them or to make them feel immensely guilty for something, and we know that intuitively, but we don't know that when it comes to ourselves. And we also have to recognize that the world as it exists, and certainly the culture that we live in, has a very dominant individualistic narrative, of the idea that we alone are responsible for our lives, that we alone are responsible for the state of the world, and that's been pushed on us by, certainly by fossil fuel companies as well, that, you want to save the planet, you should really watch your carbon footprint. Like, it's up to you. Have you recycled? You bought a takeaway coffee cup? My God. Like, instead of actually looking at the much wider systemic issues that we need to face. And so sometimes this guilt and this shame is very linked to that, this idea that we alone are responsible for saving the world. And we really need to take that weight off our shoulders, because it's not all on us. It is on us as a collective, but as us as individuals, we can do the best that we can, minute by minute, day by day. But, we only have so much capacity. So we need to recognize that, and we need to be willing to remove the guilt and the shame, to recognize that we are not perfect. We're never going to be perfect. And all we can do is choose our next best step forward. In terms of other people, though, who are really just in survival mode, of like actual physical survival of, well, if I don't go to work today, I'm not going to eat. And, if I don't eat and provide for my family, why am I supposed to care about the environment, or why am I supposed to care about climate? This is where we need to create better support structures in place, because that shouldn't be a thing. That shouldn't exist. And we can't expect somebody to step out of survival mode or to miss out on, the day's income, when that day's income is reliant for them to eat or to pay rent. That's just not acceptable. So we need to be looking at how are we as a community creating the structures. And I don't necessarily mean government. I mean really hyper local communities here, really creating the structures so that people can begin to step out of survival mode, so that people can have that little bit of space there and relief, that they know that their rent, there's going to be space for them. That there's a food pantry over here and they can get free food from this local initiative or whatever it may be, so that they feel cared for, they feel belonging. And then what often happens is when we just get out of survival mode as well, is that's very much when a lot of our pain and trauma actually has space to come up. So we need to create, again, those community healing initiatives to, give people access to mental health care, access to therapy. And if we don't have these in our country at a free or a government level, then how can we, within our local suburb or within our church community or within our changemaker community or whatever else, can we fundraise for this? Can we have somebody offer their time? What are we doing to create space for the people that we know? Because it's hard when people are hypothetical, when people are out there, when they're somewhere else, and there's not much we can do for that. It's a hypothetical situation. So always trying to bring it back to who in my community, in my neighborhood, in my group, do I know that fits into this mold? What can I do to support them and to give that space? And then as they have that space, hopefully there's also the possibility then to look at thriving, to look at their own community initiatives, their own giving back as well.
Yes, beautiful. I do believe a lot of times, even though most times I'm talking about individual actions and what we can do, for me, the solutions and a lot of the work comes in connection to others, the collective, and that collective can be, as you're saying, your local suburb community or bigger communities that think global, act local. That is really, really important, because for me, one of the biggest changes that we could start to implement is how we are in relationships with those around us, and turning to other types of economies in terms of sharing economy, and we can do that, as small communities, and to be able to understand how we are giving, how we're creating spaces, as you're saying, for different needs, for the different people in the community, and how we can be in them to create this change. I think that is so necessary to understand that, as you're saying, like, we've been driven to believe everything is individualistic, and yes, there's a lot of work that we need to do as individuals, and a lot of work that we need to do in relationship to others in our community, and then changing the way that we are relating to nature, from thinking of resources to thinking from nourishment, and giving and receiving, and that balance, and regeneration, and a lot of this that it's so important. And I think that I would love to explore more things, but I think that I'm just going to ask you one last question for this episode, and perhaps we can explore more in another episode. But what is the one thing that you wish everyone knew?
I don't know that I can answer for everyone, but I can certainly answer for changemakers, and that is that culture becomes mind. So that whenever we recognize that something in our culture, something in our systems isn't serving us, that it's toxic, that it's causing disparity or inequality or whatever it may be, that system very likely also lives within us. And so when we're working to change it out there, we also need to look and understand and examine how it exists within us. The work is always twofold, of inner and outer together, that they're not separate. Very often, coming from a wellness background and from a spiritual new age background, the work is very much inner and very individualistic. And well, if you want to change the world, go meditate, go visualize, do the inner work. And that needs to happen. But it misses the outer change. And for a lot of activists, it's very much, well, we need to take to the streets and we need to demand this system change, but we're not understanding how this system lives within us, how we're perpetuating it when we don't mean to. So that would probably be the biggest thing that I would want people to know, that culture becomes mind. We need to start at the level that is happening within us before we move out to change things.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Laura, how can people find what you're doing, and how can people get involved and work with you?
Yeah, so I have a website, laurahartley.com. You can view all of the upcoming courses. So there's a course at the moment and happening next year called Internal Revolution, which is all about dismantling burnout cycles and burnout culture. There's also another course starting soon called Love and Anger, which is really exploring, the role and the purpose of anger in change making as well, for those of us like myself who sometimes struggle with it. There's a series of free workshops, so head on over to laurahartley.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at laura.h.hartley.
Beautiful, and I will have those links on the episode notes. But thank you, Laura, for taking the time, for sharing. I love this conversation. I would love to have a few more and to keep on exploring in deeper and wider ways with you, and to be able to share this with everyone listening. So thank you for sharing with us, and for all of our listeners. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for being listeners and actively as well participating. And as always, I would love to know, what are the things that resonated with you? What are the actions that you can start taking from this conversation? So thank you, Laura. Thank you for everything that you're doing. And I will see you hopefully soon.
Yes, thank you again. I loved being here and really value this time and your show. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Until next time, everyone. Bye.
What did you like the most about this episode? Take a moment to think about what change you can make in your life today.
Share your conscious action on social media using #ConsciousAction and tagging @ConsciousActionNZ so we can celebrate your impact on the world and create a ripple effect.
One easy action we would love for you to take right now is to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast. This will help us get these messages out into the world and inspire more people to take conscious action in their own lives, contributing to the better world we hope for.